everyone. My name is Sera Davidow, and I'm here with others from the Respite and Rights Coalition to talk to you about the mental health system and what hurts and what heals. So, what is the Respite and Rights Coalition? We are a coalition that began forming in 2023 around legislation to bring more peer respites to Massachusetts. And more recently, added into that has been legislation around the six fundamental rights. We are made up of several organizations, including MassACT, Roots Up, the Mental Health Legal Advisors Committee, and Wildflower Alliance, along with several independent advocates, some of whom you'll be hearing from today. I just want to go briefly over those two pieces of legislation so people who are less familiar have a little bit more to go on in terms of what we're talking about. The first I'm just going to touch on briefly is H.5229 and S. 1383, which is an act establishing peer-run respites throughout the Commonwealth. The important pieces to understand here are that currently there are 5 peer respites in Massachusetts. And when I say peer respite, what I'm talking about are home-like environments that are peer-led. Really, they're created by and for people who've been there in some way themselves. And people can go stay there 24/7, have their own bedroom and access to peer support and other resources as an alternative to hospitalization and other more invasive kinds of interventions. So there's 5 existing right now in Massachusetts, and this legislation would increase those numbers to at least 1 per county plus 2 peer respites that center Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, and 2 LGBTQIA plus affinity peer respites. So there's actually already 1 trans and queer peer respite in Holyoke, Massachusetts, and this would bring another. We wouldn't expect all of those, even if the legislation passed, to happen all at the same time. It would probably be a gradual workup in that way, but that's the goal. And important things to know, I kind of already touched on this, but peer respites really help keep people from having to land in psychiatric facilities where they lose a lot of power and freedoms, or in emergency departments where I think across this country there's been an issue with people getting stuck in EDs, in hallways, sometimes on beds, and it can be really a pretty awful experience. This can also reduce people's disruptions to people's lives. If someone's in school or they're working or they have people or appointments that they want to keep, they have that option to do that if they're in a peer respite, unlike if they're in a psychiatric facility that's locked. Another thing that I really love about this is that peer respites are designed around minimizing power imbalances, that in that way, they often avoid re-traumatization that can happen in more clinical environments and locked spaces. There's lots more we could say about this, and some of that you'll probably hear in people's stories. Then we have H.5229, S. 1389, which is an act modernizing the 6 fundamental rights. This is actually based on laws that have existed since the late 90s. At that time, there were only 5 of them, and they were things like right to make and receive private phone calls and mail, right to have visitors, right to humane environments. And then the 6th right was added as the right to fresh air in 2015. The thing is, though, that these rights are really outdated because who's really doing snail mail anymore? So the new bill proposition is that we're getting people access to email, to the internet. We're also talking about more culturally specific needs for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, disabled people, trans people, including the right to hormones. And if you're not aware, many people talk about having their hormones taken away when they land in locked psychiatric units. The other key to this legislation is that we are proposing that there actually be accountability for rights violations. At this point, people can report those violations to the Massachusetts Department of Mental Health. They can report them to internal human rights officers. They can report them to the Disability Law Center and similar, but there's not really a way to hold people accountable. And with this bill, we are proposing fines that would really shift that balance. Now, where are these bills right now? The exciting thing, and part of why we're creating this video, is because both of these bills are in the House and Senate Ways and Means committees. And if you're not familiar with the process, that's usually the last stop before being put before the governor to be passed into law. So the formal legislative season runs until July 31st, 2026, and most bills are going to be acted on. So we're in this critical last month or so before we'll know where these bills will land for the year and whether or not they're actually going to end up being passed. So if you are someone who wants to get involved beyond watching this video, you can write or call your legislator, especially if they are on the Ways and Means Committee. You can also write or call the chair and vice chair of the House and Senate Ways and Means Committee, or really any member of those committees. And you can share information about these bills with others. And if you use that QR code or the web address below, you will see that it will bring you to a page where you can choose between getting more information on talking points and email addresses, or you can access a sign-on letter that's already been made by Wildflower Alliance and get your voice out that way. All right, so before we get into hearing some individual stories from people in Massachusetts, I'm actually going to be talking to you about psychiatric oppression, because in order to understand the importance of some of these bills, it's important to understand psychiatric oppression itself and what we're really talking about, why some of these bills are so important. And fair warning, this presentation is designed to make people a little uncomfortable. It's designed to challenge some beliefs that people might hold about the mental health system or other things in relationship to that. And ultimately, the bottom line is comfort doesn't lead to change. So when I say psychiatric oppression, this is just a brief definition. Part of what we're talking about here is the systemic misuse of psychiatric power or diagnoses or institutional practices in ways that control, marginalize, or punish individuals, usually people who have already experienced a lot of loss of power and marginalization. And I just want to say that this is personal for me. I'm coming to you as someone who's a survivor of childhood physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, also as an adult, a survivor of domestic violence. On the other hand, I also grew up with a lot of privilege, being a white person who came from an area where there was wealth and educational access and a lot of other things that I had access to. And the reason I bring that up is because whatever I've experienced, people who have less privilege often have stories where they've experienced a lot more hardship. So just bear that in mind as you're listening. I do want to share a few things from my life, specifically some snapshots of different points in my life that speak to this topic of psychiatric oppression. And one of them is my first experience of forced hospitalization. I am somebody who has a long history of self-injury, so cutting, burning, other forms of self-injury. And there was a point at which I talked to people in the mental health system about that. And there was a particular therapist I was talking to, and her response was, well, you have a choice. And this is an example of the sorts of choices many of us have in the mental health system are presented with these, what I would call fake or false choices, where someone says to you, as this therapist said to me, you have a choice. You can either go to the hospital voluntarily, or if you don't choose to go to the hospital voluntarily, we will force you to go to the hospital. And I didn't know a ton about what that looked like at the time, but I did know that it would probably be a much less violent way to get to the hospital to just say, okay. And so I said, okay. The thing is that when I got to the hospital, nobody really asked me anything meaningful. It was just like I was being contained there. They didn't ask me, why was I hurting myself? They might ask me, can I see your burn so I can see if it's infected? But they never said, what does this mean to you? Why are you doing this? And I could have told them some version of sometimes I feel so far outside of my body that I'm looking down on myself, and hurting myself helps ground me. It helps me get me back in my body. And in this world full of emotional pain that I haven't been able to control, this is a sort of physical pain that I can control, and it provides a release. And by the way, even though you think that this is a sign that I'm about to kill myself, it's the very best way I have found to keep myself alive. And you just took it away from me. And part of my healing, part of my process after that was, first of all, after having that experience, to recognize this wasn't actually a place I could talk about this. And so I spent a lot of years not telling anyone that I was struggling once I got away from that system. But then once I got to a place where I felt safer, where I felt less vulnerable to someone locking me up again, I started writing about it. And that was really meaningful and healing to me. And I put it out there. I'm not a journaler. I don't really like to write to myself, but I do like to write to other people and hear a response back and not feel invisible. And I was doing that, publishing articles on that in America. And I published one about self-injury and what that had been like for me. And lots of people responded to it. And that was powerful for me. But then As I mentioned, I'm a domestic violence survivor. And all these years later, I think something like 10 years later, after putting that article out about self-injury, I found myself in divorce court. And my ex-husband and his attorney were using my article on self-injury to try and demonstrate why maybe I shouldn't have access to my kids. And the reality is, the judge was hearing them. I had some really awful experiences, both in that family court and then with the Department of Children and Families. And all of them were looking at this history that I had, I thought, done a lot of powerful things to overcome and to integrate into this full life I was building. And they were using this in front of judges to suggest that I actually shouldn't be responsible or seen as responsible for my kids. And one particular judge started actually talking about maybe my youngest child, should be removed from my home. And I think of that as an example of psychiatric oppression. And I will tell you, I'd like to say, oh, I was able to get through to her and convince her that no, that's not what this was about. The reality is, what actually saved me was Massachusetts has a mandatory retirement age for judges, and she hit her retirement age, and then she was removed from the case, and I got a different judge who was better in that regard anyway. That's what saved me. And so that is an example of psychiatric oppression. Now, I want to stop talking so much about myself, and I want to bring you into this timeline of examples of psychiatric oppression over the years, because there's many examples, far more examples than I'm going to be able to cover today. But I want to do a few in the 1800s. Now, a couple of examples from the 1800s, from particularly the 1850s, are called drapetomania and dysaesthesia aethiopica. Those were both created by the psychiatrist, and it was in regards to Black people, particularly with drapetomania, enslaved Black people. And the only real symptom for that one was that they had tried to run away. And the cure, the treatment, was pretty brutal. It was things like cut off their toes so they couldn't run away. And then the dysaesthesia aethiopica was whether people were enslaved or not, meant to refer to people who were being quote unquote lazy when working in the fields. And some of the symptoms were things like sores on their back. And if you think about the history and what was happening to people who weren't doing as they were told in the fields, you can kind of put two and two together as to where those sores were coming from. But this is a really solid example, hard to turn away from and say it's not real, of how the psychiatric system and these diagnoses can be used to as a really as a tool of social control and as an example of psychiatric oppression. Then we go to the 1860s and we can talk about Elizabeth Packard. Elizabeth Packard ended up in a psychiatric facility for 3 years, committed by her husband. And the main thing she was committed for were disagreeing with his religious views and his childbearing views. And when she was there, she found lots of other women who were like her. And she also spent a lot of time writing about the inhumane conditions that they were all being subjected to. Now we can look at the 1870s and Joseph Lobdell. Joseph was a trans man who was committed for exactly that, being a trans man. And one interesting thing about his story is that he was actually listed as having died in the same year that he was hospitalized, 1879. In reality, he survived until 1912 in that same psychiatric facility. To me, that really speaks to some of the same invisibility with which trans people are being treated in today's current climate. That was a long time ago, right? And if we stuck there, it gets really easy for people to say, oh, yeah, that's the past. That's the history. That's not where we're at now. So let's keep moving forward. Now we're in the mid 1900s, particularly 1939 to 1941. One piece of the Holocaust that a lot of people aren't aware of is called Action T4. Now, that actually, in some ways, just preceded some of the concentration camps because it was actually used as practice for the concentration camps. This is a project that involved the death of approximately 300,000 people with physical and psychiatric disabilities. And they were brought into these same environments, gas chambers, et cetera, and seen as not having value and were killed in many instances. And I want to show you a brief video clip of a film that is actually focusing on this project because many people talk about the Holocaust. There's been many films made about the Holocaust, but there's been very few conversations about this T4 project that many people just have never heard of.
We all sort of have an idea of what the Holocaust was and how we commemorate it. But all of these assumptions are challenged when Nazi euthanasia comes into Holocaust memory.
Concentration camp victims or more sympathetic prisoners were seen more as martyrs. The euthanasia program, it was poorly understood. There were German victims, they were disabled victims, and it just didn't garner the press or the interest.
My great-grandmother got killed by the Nazis in the T4 program, the program that killed people who were in psychiatry.
It was assembly line production of death in which everyone was complicit.
There was basically no prosecution. They were put back in high positions. They made careers after that. The perpetrators.
The government, the leaders of the memorials, they didn't think that this is an important aspect.
And the victims did not get anything, except even more pain and getting hurt.
So this film is called Disposable Humanity. I'm a part of Roots Up, and we're going to be looking to have a full screening on this, really what is often an erased part of history. But then we can say, all right, first we talked about things that are really a long time ago. Now we're talking about things that are still kind of a long time ago and not even in the US. So let's keep moving forward. Then we go to the 1950s in the US, and unknown to a lot of people, white women, mostly middle-class white women, were the group that was most commonly given the diagnosis of schizophrenia. And their hospital files would say things like, embarrassed her husband, wasn't keeping up with housework and childcare, or reads too much. But then, as things are happening in the civil rights movement, we shift from mostly middle-class white women to Black men in the 1960s. And they become the group that are most commonly given the schizophrenia diagnosis. And their hospital files say things like, paranoid about the police. But while we can keep digging into these pieces, it's also important to know that sometimes when people do recognize some of these things in history, they seek to find ways to make them more palatable. And I want to use the diagnosis of homosexuality as an example of that. When people talk about homosexuality as a diagnosis, they often say, well, in 1973, that was removed from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is where it's often called the Bible of psychiatry. It's where people get the diagnoses that they use for billing labels and so on and so forth. And that is true. It was itself removed in 1973. However, the further truth is that diagnoses like sexual orientation disturbance and ego dystonic homosexuality stayed in the DSM for another 14 years. And then we have the International Classification of Diseases, which is used by the World Health Organization. They actually didn't remove the diagnosis of homosexuality until 1990. And then with that bottom one that you see there, ego dystonic sexual orientation or sexual relationship disorder, that one didn't come out until 2022. So that's 49 years. And that's a very different history. It's a very different picture, a much less comfortable picture than saying, oh yeah, that came out of the DSM in 1973. Now, let's go to Massachusetts itself and the 2000s. So we really want to bring this up to current times. In 2012, this judge that you see here, her name's Christina Harms, and I would argue that that last name of Harms is appropriate to her. She presided over a case regarding a woman who was pregnant and also had psychiatric diagnoses and was taking psychiatric drugs. And the Massachusetts Department of Mental Health actually filed to have the parents of the woman become her guardians so that they could force her to have an abortion. Now, Judge Harms not only ruled in favor of the forced abortion, but she tacked on forced sterilization too. And although an appeals court ended up overturning that decision, the judge continued to publicly defend it. And we're going to hear from her for just a couple minutes of that.
And Judge Harms joins us on the line right now. Good morning. Good morning.
It seems to me that the appeals court cited two main issues with your ruling. The first was the woman's religious views. She described herself as very Catholic and opposed to abortion. How do you balance something like that as a judge when you're trying to make a decision about someone who has mental health issues but says what her views might be and then her family's request?
I considered such factors as the fact that she had had a previous abortion, the fact that I didn't see any evidence of very Catholic behaviors, things like, for example, going to church, wearing a cross. I didn't think that having premarital sex or sex with multiple partners were very Catholic behaviors.
Now, one of the things that the appeals court took issue with was your order that the woman be sterilized after the abortion procedure. Why order that as well?
After a great deal of thought, the issue of sterilization seemed to me to be too closely connected to my substituted judgment that an abortion was appropriate for Mary Moe. I struggled for quite some time with whether it would be intellectually dishonest for me to just push the sterilization dilemma aside. I didn't find anything to suggest that she would stop her practice of unprotected sexual activity, and I believed that these particular circumstances compelled me to address the question of whether Mary Moe's substituted judgment would be to continue serial, unplanned pregnancies and therefore serial abortions.
Now, obviously, that was the thing that many people felt was a draconian measure to take on the part of a judge.
Mm-hmm. I think it has to be balanced against the draconian possibility of serial future abortions.
Now, one of the things that comes up in this clip that I think is worth pointing out is sometimes we talk about psychiatric oppression or other forms of systemic oppression as existing individually. But the reality is that they all compound one another. And the more marginalized experiences someone has, often the more these pile onto one another and can make the overall experiences harder and harder. So if you're listening in there to Judge Harms, she's not only talking about psychiatric oppression and making this decision, this really profound decision about abortion and sterilization for this woman because she has a psychiatric history. She's also making judgments about a woman who had had sex, basically, tying in promiscuity and her own beliefs about whether or not she could possibly be religious or be able to make these decisions on her own. So listen for that, because you're going to see those sorts of intersections and ways that oppressions compound one another. So before I stop, I just want to get right up to the last 6 months, because the reality is there's just countless examples every day of psychiatric oppression in really every part of this country. And I myself have had the experience in the last 6 months of talking to 3 different people in 3 different hospitals, all in Massachusetts, and kind of hearing the same experiences in one way or another, the same messages. And I'm talking about McLean Hospital, a Worcester psychiatric unit, and then one of the long-term DMH state hospitals. And the things I was hearing from people across the board were, why aren't they listening to me? It feels like they're punishing me. This is an unwinnable game. And I'll give you an example of that comes out of McLean Hospital, which is pictured there. That's supposed to be one of the good ones and maybe even the best one in the state by reputation. But one of the things I was hearing from the person who was being held there was, well, they told me I can't be released because I'm not participating in going to groups, and they need to see me participating in going to groups before I can be released. And so she said, okay, and started going to lots and lots of groups. And then they came back and said, you're going to too many groups. We know that you're just doing this to get out, and we don't believe it's genuine or a sign that you're ready to be released. And it's like, well, what do you do with that? This is this really narrow window of what's actually seen as acceptable that nobody tells you, because again, it can be a real unwinnable game to navigate these systems. And then I was also hearing from people, it's worse to have rights no one pays attention to than to have no rights at all. Now, here you'll see pictured, we changed from McLean to one of the state hospitals in Massachusetts. And I will tell you, this is one of the hospitals where I've spent an awful lot of time advocating with someone you're going to actually hear from shortly. And I was really struck, which is, it takes a lot to strike me in this way these days because I've been doing this for a lot of years, but I was really struck by how many people could be involved. The Disability Law Center, the person hospitalized, me as an advocate, other people as an advocate, all trying to push for things to change. And there really wasn't anything, even when I could get access to people who had the most power in that system, that I could say that really had enough power to make them change. Even when the Disability Law Center or other places might get involved, we're seeing now pretty repeatedly that even attorneys saying this isn't right, this is a rights violation, still isn't necessarily leading to people being accountable to things that are happening or to change. And that is a really powerful example of psychiatric oppression, and also a really powerful example of why we need some of the laws that we need on the books, because these other methods aren't enough. Now, before I turn it over, I also want to share that a few weeks ago, my boyfriend and I went to a comedy show, and this comedy show was Chris Turner. And we didn't know anything about Chris before we got there. In fact, we did not know that Chris's shtick was that he is a white rapper from England who improvs raps based on audience feedback and things that are going on there. And that in and of itself is a lot to unpack. But what I really want to talk about isn't so much Chris as it is Colleen. Colleen was front and center in the audience with Chris's performance. We were a little bit behind her. And Colleen turned it out to be a psychiatric nurse. Now, here's the thing. I just told you, right, that Chris's shtick is to take things about audience members, props, jobs, where they're from, all sorts of things, and improv raps. So the moment we hear psychiatric nurse, all of a sudden we're hearing raps about how, oh, people in psych hospitals, they all throw shit all the time at people. Like everyone I know comes home covered in shit because everyone who's hospitalized there is throwing it around. And I'm like, oh my gosh, well, that's not true. I've actually never seen such a thing. I'm not saying it could never possibly happen, but it's certainly not what happens typically. And then we also started hearing raps about straitjackets, like, ha ha, how funny. And, what was I going to do? There wasn't really much for me to do in that moment. But it was a real reminder, in addition to what I already said about how little power we have to get people to really change, we also are in a society where that's a really accepted joke. Those stereotypes are completely accepted. No one's going to challenge them. And so how on earth else are we going to get people to actually listen to us if we don't have laws like the ones we are talking about today to back us until we can change those public attitudes? So when there are massive power differentials and a long history of systemic oppression, and the people in the power down position are saying something's wrong, the ask is to believe us. And when we tell you that things like involuntary outpatient commitment, which is a whole nother law that people are trying to get through, which is S.1115, an act to provide continuum of care for severe mental illness, when we tell you that that's going to make the power differentials, the power imbalances worse and cause more harm, believe us. And when we tell you that we need support spaces like peer respites, where those power imbalances aren't so big and healing actually feels possible, it's really important that people believe that too. And when we tell you that rights without any way to actually enforce them are killing us, we're asking you to believe that. Now, if you still need to be further convinced about how we are often regarded by the general public, how we are treated in these systems, I'm going to play you just like a 15-second video. This video is from April 29th, 2026, another town in Massachusetts. My friend has been taken into that ambulance and is about to be sectioned to a hospital for evaluation. He is not acting out in any way that people might describe. He's not yelling, he's not fighting them. But here is what the police officer who's on the scene says anyway.
Yeah, if you want to just... Yeah, I'm going to sit here for a few minutes, just in case. I'll just tase his ass.
So I hope that leaves an impression about how people are being treated in these systems and why we're having these conversations and why these laws are so important. So we're going to move into a section of this now where we're going to talk about what hurts and what heals from the experience of different people who've really been there in Massachusetts. We're going to hear from Steiner, Deja Carr, Estelle Collins, and Marty Hadge. And so I'm going to turn it over to Ant.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Sarah. I've seen you do that presentation before, and each time I see you do it, it has a really big impact on me. And I am one of the people that has lived experience, is talking from inpatient psychiatric setting. So I just wanted to thank everyone for giving me an opportunity to share my story. The potential to improve patient care in Massachusetts gives my life meaning. My name is Steiner. I'm a queer, gender diverse human rights activist. I've been hospitalized in Massachusetts Department of Mental Health wards for 5 years because of suicide attempts while in a previous hospital. The bills we're talking about today, I think, are probably the most critical and impactful legislation ever to come before the legislature in Massachusetts for mental health patients, especially in psychiatric hospitals. For 5 years, I have witnessed constant human rights violations and almost zero accountability. I've written hundreds of complaints, 99% of which have been unsubstantiated, leaving me feeling discouraged, powerless, and humiliated. This is not unique to me. Legal advocacy groups that I work with and other patients confirm that DMH unsubstantiates almost every single complaint that's submitted. I want to urge the legislature and the public and anyone who's watching this to witness this alarming reality firsthand. You can actually request random samples of complaints, decision letters, and investigation reports from DMH from the past 5 years. And when you read those, not only will you notice that almost all of them are unsubstantiated, the language used by DMH is often biased, includes irrelevant details that cast patients as offenders, and reaches conclusions that are contradicted by the investigation's own findings. Lawyers tell me they won't take cases against DMH because accountability is so rare that DMH appears immune. In fact, a judge told a friend of mine recently, as a career prosecutor and judge in Massachusetts, I have never seen a case brought against DMH. It has near absolute immunity. DMH knows this. It rarely enforces its own policies. Its new visitor policy is so blatant in its disregard for the law that it amounts to giving the legislative body the middle finger. The DMH Office of Inpatient Management recently issued a policy that quotes the 6th Fundamental Rights Law that affirms the rights for patients to receive visitors in private, while simultaneously requiring staff to violate that law through constant observation of every visit. Please ask for a copy of this policy. As many who listen to this may be lawmakers, you're the persons responsible for writing these laws, and I'm curious as to what your own impressions will be. We need accountability, and that's exactly what the bill, an act modernizing the 6 fundamental rights, will give us. It will create a process independent of DMH to investigate alleged violations and issue fines when substantiated. As a patient who is currently hospitalized in a long-term psychiatric ward run by the Department of Mental Health, I witness these violations happening on a daily basis. They are often shockingly egregious and almost never have consequences for the offenders. I want to give you 4 incidences that have happened recently to me that represent violations of the 6 fundamental rights, and there were no consequences for the offenders for any of these incidents. 1, I am constantly misgendered, constantly. Staff claims it's accidental. However, after 5 years, that hardly seems an excuse. I even have advocates and staff, correct staff, and visitors correct staff, and they're just summarily dismissed. 2, approximately 16 months ago, I was restrained. The law requires an immediate and serious risk of harm. The hospital's own report acknowledged I was so calm that I walked to the restraint table and lay down. They still initiated a physical and chemical restraint and left me there for 45 minutes. The Disability Law Center investigated, found the restraint appeared illegal, and because of its particularly egregious nature, wrote the commissioner requesting a revision and update of restraint policies. DMH's response amounted to, well, the doctor ordered it, so it's fine. I still think about this restraint every day. It's been over a year, and there were no consequences for the offenders. 3, my off-unit electronics access has been restricted for almost 7 months now because I didn't hear staff during a walk and I took a brief video of a fancy car in Franklin Park. For months, my treatment team refused to discuss this with advocates or explain clear steps about how I could reasonably regain access, which is a violation of DMH's policy. You already heard Sera Davidow, who's my DMH-assigned advocate, mention that when she finally received the answers that she was seeking, and after she reviewed the video in question, it contradicted every justification the hospital had offered. My doctor acknowledged that no one had informed me that I hadn't heard staff during a walk, nor did he attempt a least restrictive measure as required by law to correct the issue. He claimed that I had ignored staff instructions to not take a video of the car, but the video reveals that simply didn't happen. Sera has made these arguments with proof to DMH's medical director, the Office of Inpatient Management medical director, Lemuel Shattuck's hospital medical director, and my psychiatrist. And 7 months later, I still don't have full electronics access, which severely limits my outdoor access and worsens my stress, anxiety, and my suicidality. The final incident I'd like to describe, a disability law center advocate was meeting with me privately recently when the charge nurse interrupted us to demand that the advocate supply her with a list of the patients that he'd met with. This is a violation of the law and it's just simply unethical. Patients must not feel surveyed when exercising their right to meet with the people they're responsible for helping to protect those rights. I filed a complaint the next day. The plants I had in my room for a year were taken without notice or explanation. Weeks later, Sera was finally told that the plants were taken due to a policy from the Department of Public Health. Sera asked for that policy. The hospital eventually acknowledged there is no such policy and then came up with a new explanation, which is that it's just best practice. However, they cannot or will not point to this best practice. My plants are gone. They were the only living things that gave me joy. They were the only living things I've been able to care for in the entire 5 years I've been here. And now I cannot have them back, and I have no explanation offered. And then my world just keeps feeling like it's getting smaller and smaller. After 4 years now of reporting abuse, I have faced brutal retaliation. I was illegally transferred under restraint despite being calm to an acute short-term forensic ward with no due process, one of the most dangerous floors that DMH runs. And I believe this happened because I was filing complaints and I reported the death of Jean Bash, a transgender patient, as suspicious. Advocates and outside organizations worked really hard to get me to transfer to a safer hospital, and my only request to DMH at the time was to not be transferred to floor 10 North at Lemuel Shattuck Hospital. I'm speaking to you from floor 10 North at Lemuel Shattuck Hospital. I'm taking a significant risk in speaking to you today. Please help keep me safe by taking this seriously and by keeping what's happening to me visible. Letters of concern and letters of support to DMH have been helpful for me in the past. If you're interested, you can reach out to me at rainbowsandhuman@proton.me. I believe with more access to peer respites, and I've been to multiple peer respites, I would never have been in this cycle of hospitalizations. And if the 6 fundamental human rights were honored, I do not believe I would have, I believe I would have been discharged successfully years ago. And so I urge the legislators to pass the bill H H.5231 S1381, an act modernizing the 6 fundamental rights, and Bill H.5229 S1389, an act establishing pure respites throughout the Commonwealth. And if you are in the public, please write letters of support. This, as I mentioned, I really do believe that this is the most critical legislation that could be help psychiatric patients, and we're in the big push here. I just want to thank you all for hearing my story, and thank you for hearing the humanity behind the statistics, and thank you for your ongoing commitment to protect the rights of every patient in Massachusetts.
Thanks. And
hearing you speak each time literally makes me first really angry at the system, but it also makes me like feel compelled to like study what's going on and hopefully be an advocate for others who have had the same experience. Because I've also dealt with a lot of medical racism and horrible sexism and not transphobia, but just so many horrible things. And I want to go into law now. I'm getting an English degree right now, but I really want to go into law, but I don't know if I can do it. But I can't sit around and watch I just had a psychiatry appointment, and they still have the wrong diagnosis for me after like 10 years. And it's just I hope you get your plants back.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I've gotten some concessions, and it's like I want my plants. So if you want, it seems so small, but it's really not. It's like they were my pets.
When I was in the hospital, I also had plants, which they told me that I couldn't have because it attracted bugs. I was there for maybe a year or two, bouncing around the Boston, Massachusetts health care system, and the plants, it sounds like it wouldn't have been so formative, like those plants, but like I totally understand. They're babies. They're like, you care for them, you watch them grow, and you see how freely they can grow, and it really does something to your mental health. So I get that.
now we're going to hear from Deja.
Thank you for having me, everyone. Thank you so much to Sera and Anne and Marty and Estelle and everyone who has come together to speak and share our stories. So I do not know if peace is the goal or if it's possible, but I know that I believe in a future where gender-affirming care, fair treatment, access to reproductive justice, global hunger relief, and mental health care, among other things, aren't radical notions or merely ideas that are never acted upon. And maybe that's why we're here, to act. To be together with common goals, because at our most removed, we must think about how the fair treatment of another affects us on our off days, when we are with our families, when we are sleeping. What is a common thread? Well, it's common ground. It's this: the division of classes, political parties, personal ideologies, beliefs, convictions, impositions, race, gender, etc. lead us to believe we know what our neighbor needs, but don't ask what your neighbor needs. Demand what they deserve. In my time at ServiceNet, I've seen people treated like children, like criminals, like extra paperwork, like they didn't have minds and goals and hopes for the future. To keep this personal, I often write about my experience in my work, but what I've never touched is the medical trauma. The diagnoses that come after a conversation with a woman who wouldn't touch my hand, being tied to the bed with aching bones and spit welling up between my lips, signing away my life, having the medical system profit off my mistreatment until what was left was my breathing shell. My deep breathing shell and a lot of misguided judgment and assumptions about my character, even me back in childhood. I was raised hearing that I had an old soul, that I could see beyond. But the person you are listening to right now has a Rogers order she can't shake. She's published a book. She's loved by her community and loves them so much more. She's released an album. She's a senior at a university. She collects books and goes to protests, and yet she is widely unheard. She's animalized. What does it matter that all our voices are heard? Well, if we were the only ones talking, that wouldn't look like progress. It would look like sheer regression. Be pleased when the underdog wins, because if not for them, we wouldn't know diversity. We wouldn't truly know ourselves. We are not free until and unless we are all free. As a cis black woman, I speak to what I can where I can. And I'm often seen as an idealist in black spaces. But I'd rather look at the sun with open eyes than a hole in the ground where someone I love, or even someone I just met, has been laid. My name is Deja Carr. I am 29 years old and I'm a multidisciplinary artist specializing in the black fringe space. Ideas of love and personhood and more. I'm here asking you to sit with yourselves and really get down to the bones of it all. Do you matter? And to whom? Do I matter? And to whom? If you don't see color, then what separates us? If you do, what separates us? The reason I have this strange idea that is basically why does it matter is because at our most removed from the reasons why or the various histories, which we are not, the ways a person is loved and accepted really affects us very little materially. In other words, it doesn't do your dishes faster. I'm taking information from a system that once medicalized my ancestors running away, calling it drapetomania. I'm taking information from my personal goal of every being on this earth having a functional, intact nervous system regardless of who they are. I'm advocating for people, all people, but sometimes when folks are at risk, certain ways to help are time sensitive and must be sensitive to the various identities. The only mistake that has ever been made in history is announcing the worth of a person you didn't understand. And you don't have to understand my history to see my future. I've survived the mental break called insanity. I've survived being on 7 drugs without being given my differential diagnosis. I've been giving other people's medication on accident. I've had my belongings thrown away, clothing, my grandmother's ashes. I've survived my humanity torn down in the name of progress. I've given my independence away for a subsidized apartment. But in this, there is the beauty of ended cycles. That's where you come in. If the first thing you think about me is that I'm strong, you're missing the point, although you're right by concession. Strength and resilience are words that make black women feel less than. We share bread with our captors when they are hungry because we know how to step in and make things level. These things are not my birthright but my social inheritance. My birthright is yours. It is the pursuit of happiness, love, community, leisure, visibility. It is love and generational wealth in every sense. It is the freedom to believe in a God that looks like me. And it is an image in your mind where I sit whole and respected from my head to my toe. Safety is a commodity that is coveted by those who can buy it or those of whom who have always known it. If you look around the room, we have more in common than not, and that is the beginning of the mending of a system that is built on a crooked foundation. My story is one of resilience, but I can't sit here and talk about pain because my faith does not waver at the hands of oppression. It doesn't stagger when I'm down. My story is nowhere near unique, but what is unique in our climate is the act of being someone who says enough is enough. It is being someone who says, you know what? I have value beyond what I've been given. We all have value beyond what has been given. So what legacy will you leave when you're gone? Last night I was reading Rilke in my small apartment and wanted to leave you with something creative. I read this part again, but I don't have the book. I gave it away. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Deja.
Thank you.
Is there anything in between before we go to Estelle?
Well, I just got back from a psychiatry appointment and I asked my psychiatrist what my diagnosis was, and he told me I was diagnosed with bipolar schizoaffective, which makes very little sense if you spend a day or a week or an hour with me, or like a year or a month or any sort of time. What I had been exhibiting was a lot of anger, but that anger was pretty sustained, and it was an anger that wasn't focused on a person, but rather a system. And the diagnosis came so quickly that I didn't really have time to contest it. And then came the Rogers order and the forced hospitalizations, and I had 15 hospitalizations in about 5 years, maybe. Some of them 5 years. It must have been more than that. That time, it sort of happened before COVID and a little bit after COVID, and then I was forced into the system at group homes, local group homes, moved around a bunch. And if there's anything I've learned in that time, it was really that the powers that be, DMH, ServiceNet, even, the local hospitals, their priorities were not healing. They were labeling, isolating, and damage control, but only damage to certain types of people and certain property. And I realized that my healing was going to have to happen on my own terms. And it was pretty impossible with the tools that I was given, so I had to go to school. And yeah, things have been pretty tough. I'm in a ServiceNet apartment right now, and they do unit checks every week, so you have to have staff in your apartment. The place that I live is outside is pretty gross. I've fallen a couple times. No lawsuits, obviously. I've been given my neighbor's medication at the group home, and there's just been a lot of horrible treatment. But most of it makes me feel like, in some way, if what's been written about me on the computer, or what's written about me every night, it's like, oh yeah, Deja's doing fine, but the diagnosis has this picture of a person that doesn't look or act anything like me, and it makes me, this is very strange and can't really be explained, but it makes me feel very dirtied, like murky water. And it's mostly just because there's something permanent on somebody's computer that won't be rewritten. It's in this history books, and it can't be contested.
It's slander. It's like
slander.
Somebody slandering you. Yeah.
It feels like slander.
Yeah.
I feel like a puddle of lake water here. But that's it. Yeah, I don't want to take too much time, but it's just horrible, and I wouldn't wish having that happen to anybody.
Yeah. That's what the diagnosis, the labels, that's what they do. They slander us. It makes you feel like this sticky, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I bet you had a lot of valid things to be angry about.
Mm-hmm.
So now we are going to hear from Estelle.
Hi, everyone. I'm Estelle Collins. I am a peer specialist, a advocate, a coach, mental health and trauma survivor. And these are some of my experiences with the harm that I endured during the years I was trapped in Massachusetts DMH-funded psychiatric hospitals, group homes, and crisis units. My memories are filled with trauma, darkness, and despair that didn't come from the trauma that I already had when I entered the system, but are because of that system. I think of the verbal and emotional abuse, the shame I was made to feel for the struggles I needed support and empathy for. A house manager in a group home who said to me, if you want to kill yourself, go ahead and do it. The punitive actions taken against me in the state hospital, where they isolated me away from everyone else on the unit and did not allow anyone to speak to me because I had hurt myself. I was not allowed to speak to the staff for anything either. I was completely isolated in silence. I had only a bare mattress and a Johnny to wear, instead of giving me kindness and support, as I was very desperate, depressed, and suicidal. They stripped me of my humanity and treated me like a prisoner and left me completely alone in the darkness of the thoughts in my mind. I think of the physical abuse, in particular, the repeated and unnecessary restraints at the state hospital. So many times I lost count. Over a year and a half, several times a week, I was dragged down the hall of the unit at any moment to the quiet room and strapped down to the bed. Tight leather straps at each wrist and each ankle, and a sheet tied tightly across my back to keep me from being able to move from the bed in any direction. I felt like I couldn't breathe, which triggered flashbacks to sexual trauma memories while struggling beneath the strong arms strapping me down. They would leave me there for hours, so long I would often lose control of my bladder. They would leave me in that room, tied to the bed, face down, crying, having flashbacks in the dark with the door shut for several hours. They did this to me so many times every week that I always had faint bruises on my wrists and ankles for a year and a half. I was so traumatized in that state hospital, I would track the days, months, and then almost 2 years I spent in there by drawing lines on the walls in groups of 5, like you see on prison walls, little lines in stacks of 5, tracking all my stolen time. I was being punished even though I committed no crime. I still now, all these years later, can't wear a seatbelt in a car because it gives me flashbacks and panic attacks reminding me of being restrained. I think of one of the most traumatic events of my life that happened to me was when I lived in a group home. A severe and extreme violation of my privacy, my body, my mind, and my very essence of what makes everything about my being. I was raped by a staff person in an all-women's group home. This event was more traumatizing to me than the childhood sexual abuse I had already survived. It singularly broke my body, mind, and soul more than the entire lifetime of trauma I had already lived through. The monster, disguised as a staff person, violated every part of me. He sucked out every bit of reason I had to live when he raped me. It was a breach in the agency policy at the time to schedule a male staff at that program as a safety precaution, because we were all woman program and all of us had survived sexual trauma. The day it happened, the male relief staff was left alone at the group home with us unsupervised. When we were left alone, he took advantage of that neglect, and the staff I went to for help protected the reputation of the agency and not me. When I told them what happened, I broke down. I melted and cried tears from wells of despair, and I was lost in a darkness that the group home pushed me deeper into when they threw me out as a punitive action for hurting myself as a result of the trauma of being raped. They made me feel like nobody would believe me because I didn't say anything right away because I was too afraid to. They blamed me and made me feel more ashamed when I was the one who was assaulted. They didn't want a stain on the agency's reputation, so I became a problem. I was too afraid to do anything. The district attorney from the local police station tried to convince me to press charges, but I was too afraid of the retaliation from the staff running the group home and the organization because of how they were treating me for reporting what had happened. I didn't press charges at the time because of that fear. Even though I backed down, they found a reason to kick me out and to make me disappear in order to protect their reputation. They pushed me out and made me feel guilty for reporting it happened at all. I attempted suicide because I was isolated, shamed, and stripped of my humanity. Not only had I been raped, but I had been made to feel ashamed for speaking up and asking for help. I spent 6 more months in another state hospital because I had attempted suicide, locking me up instead of the man who assaulted me. I had been kicked out and made homeless for daring to use my voice and speak up about my abuse. And many years followed, full of struggles with severe PTSD and suicide that would not have happened otherwise. These were people and facilities that I was told would provide me safety and support. Instead, I was treated like a prisoner, isolated, ignored, tied down, and bruised. assaulted and left feeling voiceless, alone, and broken. It's so important to establish a solid form of accountability to ensure true and real due process so that this will no longer be allowed to happen to people. There was no true accountability for what happened to me at that group home and at that hospital and all the other places, and my voice was never heard. I went through these things and did not get the due process I deserved. People were not held accountable. Instead, the staff backed each other up and blamed the victim. They protected the reputation of the agency, of the DMH funded system, not me. And as a result, I was abused and it was allowed to happen. If the policy was followed and the agency didn't have a male staff in the first place, I never would have been assaulted. Where is the accountability? Where is my due process? Where is my justice? Where is the due process for so many others? These things are not isolated occurrences. They happen every day, and the perpetrators continue to get away with violating people in DMH-funded spaces, and without accountability, there will be no change. This has to stop now. Having a fine assessed with every violation is a beginning that will provide incentive to DMH-funded facilities to follow guidelines and make sure they hold staff accountable when gross violations or abuses occur. These fines will fund the victims of violations in whatever way is needed. An act modernizing the 6 fundamental rights, as 1389 H5229, is a historical and necessary step towards true due process and accountability for victims of abuse in DMH-funded spaces. Peer support focuses on strengths and supports recovery in the ways the person identifies as best for them and encourages self-advocacy and personal choice. Peer respites are not power over environments. Rather, the relationships are built on connection between the supporter and the person based on shared experiences and empathy, allowing the person to be in control of their own recovery, which creates hope, promotes the person's voice, builds self-confidence to replace the shame and trauma instilled by the DMH funded system, and it promotes an environment of healing and potential growth. This is why we need to establish peer respites across Massachusetts, and the bill H5231 S1381 establishing peer respites across Massachusetts is a vital important step. I know if I had access to peer support and peer respites when I was in the system, all of that trauma could have been avoided.
Thank you, Estelle, for sharing that and for helping tie it in with the bills that we're looking at. Yeah.
And thank you for that so much. I'm glad you're still here.
I'm glad I'm still here now. Like, I mean, I still feel, I still struggle with feeling suicidal like every day, but it's something I've learned how to be able to manage living with, and now I can support others and do advocacy and work to be on the other side of things too. Do you know what I mean? Like, I've gotten to this different point where it's like I can feel that but still live and still have joy. It's like to have the darkness and the light at the same time instead of just being consumed by the darkness.
Thanks again to Estelle and to Deja and as well. And now for our last speaker, Cindy.
Hi, everybody out there. Thanks for being interested in hearing what things are like for people who have been in the system and for some of us who also have found support outside of the traditional mental health system. Thank you to Sera for sharing the social and historical context, the big picture. And thank you to Anne, Estelle, and Deja for their articulate, honest sharing, keeping it real, sharing the uncomfortable truth. If you ever have a chance to see Deja perform on stage, I can remember seeing Deja before they were even an adult, playing music and doing spoken word. It was amazing. And so, emotional distress occurs in a personal, social, and relational, and cultural and political context. It's not just some chemicals in my head, it's me being in the world and how I navigate that world and how that world navigates me. So there's this larger context that often gets ignored. And sometimes, my problem may not be my brain chemistry. My problem might be living in a oppressive society. It might be a lack of resources. It might be tough things have happened in my life, and I don't know how to make sense of them. And I'm not sure if I was made to be on this planet or not. In any event, I used to be a Department of Mental Health client, and the part that I enjoyed about that experience was I had a case manager that she would drive me around her car, and I would cry. And she wouldn't try to get me to stop crying. She wouldn't interrupt me. She would drive and drive, and that was a healing environment for me. It was a place, a time and a space where I was allowed to express emotion without it being pathologized. At the time, that was like the only space I had where I could do that. Another interesting thing about my involvement in the mental health system was that I began smoking at 50 years old, in order to have access to the outside, to fresh air. And then when they banned smoking on psychiatric units, I lost that. Um, and so we have, this alleged right, fundamental right to fresh air legally, but what good is it if there's no penalty for institutions not offering it? And so later in life, when I would end up in an institution, you know, smoking, you couldn't smoke and you couldn't get outside. So that was not great. I think lots of people recognize that nature, or at least fresh air, at least getting out of a locked space or having a bigger open locked space can make somebody feel more in touch with the world. I think having people be able to visit you at a time that works for them, whether you have family that works or has kids, to be flexible, being totally isolated from all your natural supports, all your community supports, can make a difficult moment even more difficult. So I'm hoping people will consider, what is our job? Is the job to really actually help people, or is it just to control, contain? And it's helpful to have information. I can remember people telling me, here are some options. And I wasn't in a place where I could have a conversation. But boy, I really appreciated that people were trying to tell me what the options were. Sometimes we talk about trauma-informed care, and I don't know what that means for some people, but for me it means you're telling somebody what's happening, why it's happening. You're certainly telling them or asking permission to be able to touch somebody before you do it, or to do this or that, versus just barking out what may sound like random orders for no real purpose. I can remember I had a recent experience where a doctor asked me, would I want to be resuscitated? And then they said, now smile. And I looked at them and I'm like, this person's, what the heck? And then my daughter said, oh, she's trying to see if you're having a stroke. Then it made sense. So it's really helpful to have information, to try to understand what is going on, whether I agree with what's going on or the logic of it. It's also somewhat comforting to know at least, what the plan is. It's even better if I have a choice in that plan, if there are options in that plan. But it's nice to at least know there's some kind of path in here somewhere. Uh, it's great to be treated like a person who has a whole story, a whole life, had a whole life beyond this moment. This moment may be one of the worst moments of my life, but guess what? Somehow I survived all those years up to this day. And I think that's important because what people might not realize is, okay, I'm seeing this person, they're this is what they're capable of. And it might be they're just having a moment. Who knows? Unless you are curious, you'll never know. I can remember meeting somebody and and I had that thought, wow, this person, blah, blah, blah. And then I talked with him and I found out he had a degree in anthropology. So my little snapshot of this person, left out the whole story. So it's great to have people look at somebody and be interested in the story instead of just pronouncing a diagnosis and giving up on somebody. The last time I faced forced commitment, I was fortunate and got to go to a FIA house up here, Respite in Massachusetts, the first one in Massachusetts, and they asked me different questions. They asked me what would be helpful, and I didn't have a clue. So then they asked me, what, if anything, has been helpful about being in the hospital? And I didn't like my answer, but my answer was, well, there is something helpful about them locking me up in a solitary confinement for days. And there was, but, if I tried to stay in my room in the hospital, under, in my bed, under my blankets, they would call that a symptom. But they could lock me up in a room and call it treatment. I thought that was kind of weird. So the people at AFIA said, hey, we have rooms. And they locked, but they locked from the inside. What a concept. And it gave me the chance to use a strategy, not in a forced way, but in a choice way, that I was in control. I could make the decision, hey, this might be the best thing for me to do, and not get pathologized or criticized for making that choice. Having meaning, purpose, and connection, to have people mirror back that have something to offer, or even if they don't know what's going on for me, there's still like goodwill going towards me. People would smile at me, and in peer support venues, and I was wondering why, and they just did, and it began to change my attitude about me and me being in this world. Somehow feeling connected to other people was really helpful, coming from an orientation of believing that people can and do recover, that they can and do recover even from awful things, that it's possible, that we are actually designed to heal. And so if we can find that path, and there are many paths, if we can support somebody to find the path for them to heal, it's possible, which is a really different attitude than you have this is lifelong, your brain's broken, and you should be happy to accept accept a very limited life. The other thing that's helpful is to know that this person is carrying all this experience. And maybe if you support them with questions and possibilities, they might just be the expert of their own experience. If you give somebody permission to try different things without being considered non-compliant or a failure, but instead to say, hey, every time you try, that's a success. One more thing I want to add in there is human touch. And there were some times on those psychiatric units where someone would hold my hand if I asked, or someone would give me a hug if I asked. And that's totally against the rules. But somehow, by having somebody hold my hand if I asked, it made me real. Thank you for listening. And please go out there, make a difference, take action, listen to people. Sometimes we rely on the mental health system because that's all we have. Sometimes it seems like the best option because it's the only option. Let's create more possibilities. Thank you.
Thank you to Cindy for closing us out today, and to everyone who's a part of the Respite and Rights Coalition for making this advocacy and these sorts of events possible. And don't forget to get involved by calling or writing your legislator or sharing the information that we've shared here today. And for anyone interested in a little bit more conversation, We will offer some outtakes from this recording right now.
I hope I'm listening to the same music when I'm like 70. I don't care.
I still listen to all the same shit I listened to in high school. I'm too old to get into a mosh pit now because I'd probably die. But like, I still love that shit. Like, it just like, I still have a young soul. You know, I'm also got the wisdom of an old lady, but I've got the spirit of a young person in me still. I also have the old soul thing. People always told me I had an old soul. When you said that, I was like, yep, I got that too. It's so funny.
It's like the first diagnosis, though. It's like they call you an old soul, and then they're like, well, you need all this stuff to like control you and make you not.
Yeah.
It's like when they called women hysteric.
It's the hysterical.
The modern version of hysteric.
Everything is the uterus's fault.
Me, talking about these dichotomies, I literally have been like, I am extremely suicidal. And I've had like hundreds of hospitalizations, and I'm very suicidal. And as much as I want to get out of the hospital, I need to make sure that I am stable so that I don't just repeat this cycle. And one of the OTs looked at me and said, "You're too intelligent and high functioning to need to be here. This is for people that scream and yell or aren't responding at all or something like that." And I was like, "You guys are." She was on my medical team, and I'm like, "You guys are really fascinating because you keep talking about this high functioning, person that I am, and yet you restrict my electronics because I allegedly didn't hear staff members because I had my headphones on, but I'm too low functioning to be able to just follow a directive and say, hey, could you lower the music on your headphones and you can have your electronics?" Like, whatever. I mean, it's just like this dichotomy of high functioning, low functioning.
Invisible but hyper visible.
Right, yeah. Invisible but hyper visible. That's another good way to.
I just watched this awesome show that was showing how fucked up the mental health system is in a horror way, but it was highlighting the fucked upness. People were just put in there, and if they weren't compliant was the word, If you weren't compliant, then they would dose them with Haldol, up the dose of Haldol, give them Haldol shots. And there was this, like, evil presence.
This is a fictional hospital?
Yes. Fictional, but you know what I mean. But there was this evil presence that had taken over years before when it was basically, like, representing, like, that control, like, what the system does to people. And it was like this evil in there that was going around like attacking the patients at night, and they were all like,
those are called nurses and doctors.
They were all like fucked up, and like they were getting lobotomies by this like demon of a dead doctor in the back like closed part of the hospital in the middle of the night, like you gotta watch it. It was just so well done, though.
I do not.
It didn't offend me. Like, the way they did it, it was like they were trying to shine. Like, I'm thinking that the writer of the show had experience like we do.
I'm gonna let the sun shine in today. I'm trying to make this darkness go away. I'll paint with colors, and I'll sing until my lungs give out. I'm gonna let the sun shine in today. And I will leave my windows open so that I can hear the sound of people talking and the wind blowing in the trees. Oh, I will open up my eyes so I can see the light. Oh, and I'll try to spread my wings so I can fly. Oh, and the darkness starts to fade. Feels like things are gonna go my way. I'm gonna let the sun shine in the day. I'm gonna let the past be filled with smoke. try to fix what has been broken and take this weight off my shoulders, 'cause I know yesterday ain't coming back. I'm gonna let the past stay in the cold. I will listen to the ocean, let its unsaid